Most people have been trained into a spiritual confusion that slowly damages their inner life. They were taught, directly or indirectly, that whatever they feel must reflect their spiritual condition. If peace disappears, faith must be weak. If sadness arrives, something must be wrong with God or with them. If emotions rise unexpectedly, prayer is blamed for failing. This confusion sounds subtle, but it is violent in its effect. It forces people to mistrust themselves, to police every feeling, and to live spiritually tense instead of spiritually grounded. The Bible never teaches this collapse of categories. Humans do, and many suffer quietly because of it. Ask yourself something uncomfortable but necessary. How many times have you felt emotional exhaustion and immediately assumed spiritual failure? How often have you tried to correct feelings with discipline instead of understanding them? This lesson confronts a line Scripture draws clearly, but teaching often erases: the difference between soul and spirit. When that line is ignored, believers punish themselves for being human. When it is restored, faith becomes stable instead of fragile. If you are searching for biblical depth that clarifies instead of condemns, stay with this space. Subscribe not as a habit, but as a decision to learn faith that strengthens rather than pressures. This reflection begins firmly because confusion here is costly. The soul is the seat of emotion, memory, reaction, and inner movement. It responds to loss, stress, hope, disappointment, and time. The spirit is different. It is the place of discernment, alignment, and quiet awareness before God. The soul can feel shaken while the spirit remains anchored. The spirit can be steady while the soul processes pain. When these realities are merged, people expect emotions to behave like convictions, and convictions to silence emotions. The result is guilt where none was required. Many believers pray against feelings God never condemned. They fight sadness instead of listening to it. They fear doubt instead of examining it. They rush toward spiritual explanations for what is often human experience. This lesson does not lower spiritual standards. It restores biblical order. It does not excuse disobedience. It removes unnecessary shame. As we continue, do not try to fix what you feel. Do not label it yet. Simply observe it. Because before healing begins, clarity must return, and clarity starts by recognizing which voice inside you is speaking and which one is meant to lead. The pain that makes no noise. There is a kind of suffering that does not announce itself. It does not collapse people publicly or interrupt their routines. It hides inside functional lives, inside prayers that sound correct, inside days that appear normal. Many wake up with an unexplainable heaviness, carry it through work, family, and responsibility, and lay it down only at night when no one is watching. This pain rarely has a clear label. It is not always grief, not always fear, not always doubt. It is simply the feeling of being internally strained, as if something inside is tired of holding itself together. And because it makes no noise, it is often ignored, even by the one carrying it. What makes this pain heavier is not the feeling itself, but the interpretation attached to it. People assume that because the pain is internal, it must be spiritual. They assume that because they feel unrest, God must be displeased. So instead of listening, they accuse themselves. Instead of resting, they try harder. Instead of allowing space, they apply pressure. Over time, the soul becomes overloaded, not by life alone, but by misunderstanding. Scripture never portrays human interior life as calm at all times. The Psalms are filled with emotional turbulence, yet they are not prayers of people abandoned by God. They are prayers of people who knew where to bring what they felt. The pain that makes noise often appears as irritability without cause, fatigue that sleep does not fix, or a quiet loss of joy in things once meaningful. People continue to believe, continue to serve, continue to show up, yet feel disconnected from themselves. This disconnect is dangerous because it convinces them that silence means absence and heaviness means failure. But the Bible presents another possibility. It shows that the soul can be burdened while the spirit remains intact, that emotional strain can exist without spiritual collapse. When this distinction is lost, people demand spiritual solutions for emotional realities, and nothing seems to work. Job spoke of bitterness in his soul while still refusing to curse God. Jeremiah wept deeply while still obeying his calling. Even Jesus acknowledged a troubled soul without questioning his union with the Father. These moments reveal something crucial. Pain does not automatically indicate spiritual decay. Sometimes it reveals humanity. The tragedy is not that people feel this quiet pain. The tragedy is that they feel it alone, believing they should not feel it at all. Until this silence is interpreted correctly, it continues to drain strength slowly, convincing believers that endurance must always look peaceful. Scripture tells a more honest story, and it invites us to learn how to read ourselves with the same wisdom God uses when He looks at us. A harmful belief many carry. One of the most damaging ideas quietly passed from generation to generation is this: that a strong believer should feel spiritually stable at all times. Not just faithful, but emotionally steady. Not just trusting, but internally calm. This belief does not usually arrive as a doctrine. It arrives as an expectation, and expectations, when unspoken, are powerful. They teach people to monitor their inner life with suspicion. The moment sadness appears, they panic. When confusion rises, they assume something is wrong. When joy fades temporarily, they search for hidden sin. Over time, believers learn to fear their own inner signals instead of understanding them. This belief turns faith into performance. People begin measuring their spirituality by how little they feel instead of how deeply they trust. Emotions become enemies to defeat rather than messages to interpret. The soul is treated like a problem to fix, not a part of humanity to shepherd. This creates a subtle but relentless pressure. Always appear strong, always sound confident, always pray with certainty, even when the heart is tired. Scripture never demands this posture, yet many carry it as if it were sacred law. The harm deepens when people start confusing emotional discomfort with spiritual disobedience. A heavy soul becomes proof of distance from God. Inner questions are labeled as lack of faith. Weariness is mistaken for rebellion. Under this belief, people stop being honest with God because they believe honesty disqualifies them. They pray carefully instead of truthfully. They filter emotions instead of offering them. Slowly, prayer loses intimacy and becomes maintenance. The soul, unheard, grows louder in unhealthy ways. This belief also isolates. When everyone feels required to appear spiritually unaffected, no one admits struggle. Silence multiplies. Comparison grows. People assume they are the only ones who feel unsettled because everyone else seems fine. The Bible shows the opposite pattern. Its most faithful figures speak openly of inner conflict without shame. The problem is not feeling too much. The problem is misunderstanding what those feelings mean. When this belief goes unchallenged, believers exhaust themselves trying to correct what was never wrong. They demand spiritual solutions for emotional processes and conclude God is distant when nothing changes. But the issue was never God's silence. It was the belief that the soul should never speak. Until this idea is exposed and released, peace remains fragile, dependent on emotional stability rather than spiritual grounding. Scripture offers something far stronger: faith that can stand even when the inner world is unsettled, turning without turning against itself. God's perspective is different. When Scripture speaks, it does not flatten the human interior. It recognizes layers, movement, and seasons. God does not respond to people as if they were only spirits trapped in bodies, nor as if emotions were obstacles to faith. He addresses the whole person with precision. From the beginning, God names distinctions. Humanity is formed, animated, and then entrusted with breath that carries life. Later, Scripture speaks of the Spirit as the place of alignment with God, the space where truth settles deeper than emotion. This is not accidental language. It reveals intention. God's perspective is not threatened by emotional fluctuation. He does not interpret sadness as rebellion or exhaustion as disloyalty. When Moses grew weary under responsibility, God did not accuse him of weak faith. He shared the burden. When David wrote of a disturbed soul, God did not silence him. Those words became scripture. These moments show that God listens differently than humans judge. He does not confuse expression with opposition. The clearest pattern in Scripture is this: God often stabilizes the soul before instructing the spirit. He restores perspective before demanding action. He meets people where they are without redefining who they are. This is why Jesus could say, "Peace I leave with you," even to disciples who would soon panic and scatter. He was not describing their emotional state. He was naming a deeper reality that would hold when emotions failed. God's perspective separates worth from feeling. It allows space for grief without redefining identity. It permits questioning without breaking relationship. This is not leniency, it is wisdom. A God who created the soul understands its fragility. A God who gives the spirit understands its strength. When these are honored in their proper place, faith becomes resilient instead of rigid. Understanding God's perspective changes how we read our inner world. It teaches us not to panic when emotions fluctuate and not to elevate feelings to spiritual verdicts. God does not rush to correct what he understands. He does not shame what he designed. His guidance does not blur the line between soul and spirit. It clarifies it, gently, patiently, until peace becomes possible without denial and faith becomes steady without pressure. A rarely remembered biblical figure. There is a figure in Scripture who appears briefly, speaks little, and then disappears without ceremony. Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah. He is not remembered for miracles or speeches, but for a moment of honesty that God chose to preserve. Baruch lived under constant tension, writing words of judgment while watching a nation crumble. At one point, his soul reached its limit. He admitted weariness, disappointment, and the quiet grief of unrealized expectations. There is no rebellion in his words, only fatigue. And God's response is strikingly gentle. He does not question Baruch's loyalty. He does not demand emotional correction. He acknowledges the pain and reframes the moment. God tells Baruch not to seek great things for himself, not as a rebuke, but as a release. It is as if God is saying, your soul is heavy because it is carrying a future it was never meant to control. Your spirit will survive this season, even if your emotions are strained by it. Baruch is promised preservation, not promotion, safety, not celebration. This interaction reveals a rare clarity. God distinguishes between the soul's disappointment and the spirit's calling. He does not confuse emotional fatigue with spiritual failure. Baruch's story matters because it gives permission to those who serve faithfully while feeling inwardly drained. He did not abandon his role. He did not dramatize his pain, he simply acknowledged it. And God responded by adjusting expectation, not identity. The soul was tired, the spirit remained aligned. That distinction saved Baruch from despair. This moment teaches something subtle and powerful. God does not always remove the circumstances that exhaust the soul. Sometimes he protects the spirit within them. Baruch is not a hero of triumph, but of survival with integrity. His story reminds us that Scripture values quiet endurance as much as visible victory. And it shows that when God listens, he listens to the right part of us, without confusing what hurts with who we are. The central spiritual principle. At the center of this lesson is a truth that quietly reorganizes the inner life. The soul is responsive, the spirit is directive. When this order is reversed, confusion grows. When it is restored, peace becomes possible even in difficult seasons. The soul reacts to what happens around us and within us. It holds memory, emotion, imagination, desire, and fatigue. It is sensitive by design. The spirit, however, is where orientation lives. It is the place of alignment, where conviction remains steady, even when feelings shift. Scripture never asks the soul to lead the spirit. It asks the spirit to shepherd the soul. This principle explains why someone can feel discouraged and still remain faithful, why a believer can feel afraid without abandoning trust, and why emotional storms do not automatically indicate spiritual collapse. Paul speaks of being pressed but not crushed, revealing two different internal experiences happening at the same time. Pressure belongs to the soul. Stability belongs to the spirit. Problems arise when people expect the soul to provide what only the spirit can give. Emotions are then forced to answer questions they were never meant to solve. The Bible does not call for emotional numbness. It calls for proper hierarchy. When the soul is allowed to speak without being crowned as judge, it becomes healthier. When the spirit is allowed to lead without being silenced by emotion, it becomes clearer. This balance produces maturity. It prevents guilt from forming where God has not placed it. It also prevents feelings from being ignored until they distort behavior. Understanding this principle changes how we respond to ourselves. Instead of asking, "Why do I feel this way? Something must be wrong with me," we learn to ask, "What is my soul reacting to? And what is my spirit anchoring me in?" This shift removes panic from inner experience. It replaces urgency with discernment. The soul no longer needs to be defeated, it needs to be guided. And the spirit no longer needs to prove itself through constant emotional stability. It simply needs to remain aligned. This is not lower spirituality, it is deeper order. The kind that allows faith to endure without self-violence and peace to exist without denial. The risk of misunderstood silence. Silence is one of the most misunderstood experiences in spiritual life. When emotions quiet down, some assume they are finally strong. When emotions grow loud, they assume something is breaking. But silence itself is neutral. Its effect depends entirely on how it is interpreted. When silence is understood as space, it becomes strengthening. When it is interpreted as absence, it becomes corrosive. The same quiet moment can either restore or weaken, not because silence changes, but because meaning assigned to it does. Many people enter silence carrying the belief that they must feel something spiritual in order for the moment to count. When nothing dramatic happens, disappointment follows. The soul grows anxious, scanning for signs, sensations, reassurance. The spirit, instead of being listened to, is drowned out by expectation. In this state, silence becomes threatening. It feels empty, unfinished, even unsafe. People rush to fill it with noise, activity, or forced emotion, afraid that stillness means disconnection. Scripture presents silence differently. Elijah did not encounter God in intensity, but in a quiet presence that required attention rather than reaction. This kind of silence did not excite the soul. It steadied the spirit. But that only happened because Elijah did not demand a feeling. He listened. Silence strengthened him because it was received, not judged. When silence is misunderstood, it weakens by turning inward without direction. People replay thoughts, rehearse fears, and allow the soul to spiral unchecked. What was meant to be rest becomes rumination. Over time, this trains the inner life to associate stillness with anxiety. The spirit is present but unheard because the soul has taken control of interpretation. The risk is not silence itself. The risk is allowing the soul to define it. When silence is placed under the guidance of the spirit, it becomes grounding. It teaches patience. It reveals what matters. It reduces emotional exaggeration. But when silence is left without discernment, it amplifies insecurity. The same quiet hour can either heal or harm. Learning this difference is essential. Silence does not automatically mature a person. It matures those who know which inner voice to trust within it. When the spirit is allowed to lead, silence becomes a companion rather than a threat. It stops being a test to pass and becomes a place to stand. How to turn this into a holy habit. Transformation does not begin with intensity, it begins with rhythm. The distinction between soul and spirit becomes real when it is practiced quietly, woven into ordinary moments rather than reserved for crisis. One simple way this begins is in the way a day is opened or closed. Before reaching for explanations, advice, or even words, pause long enough to notice what is happening inside. Not to correct it, not to spiritualize it, just to observe. Is the soul tense, tired, restless, hopeful, heavy? Naming this without judgment prevents confusion later. It keeps emotion from turning into accusation. After noticing the soul, shift attention gently. Ask a different kind of question, one the spirit can answer. Not, why do I feel this? But what remains true even if this feeling stays? This subtle movement trains the inner life. It teaches the soul it is allowed to speak, but not required to lead. Over time, this practice reduces inner urgency. Emotions no longer rush to define the day. They are acknowledged, then placed in order. This habit can be practiced during small transitions, while washing dishes, sitting in a parked car, lying awake for a few minutes before sleep. These moments are not dramatic, but they are formative. Scripture speaks of renewing the mind, not overwhelming it. This renewal often happens in quiet consistency, not spiritual effort. When the soul learns it will be heard, it stops shouting. When the spirit is consistently consulted, it becomes clearer. Another part of this habit is restraint. Not every feeling needs immediate expression or interpretation. Some emotions need time to settle before they reveal what they are responding to. Allowing space without suppression is an act of trust. It reflects confidence that truth does not panic. Over time, this practice builds internal safety. Silence becomes less threatening. Stillness becomes less charged. Turning this into a holy habit does not require more prayer, but wiser prayer. Prayer that allows emotion to arrive honestly and then waits for deeper alignment. Prayer that trusts God understands the difference between what hurts and what holds. When practiced regularly, this habit reshapes the inner landscape. The soul becomes calmer because it is guided. The spirit becomes stronger because it is listened to. And faith grows quieter, steadier, and more humane. Hope without easy promises. Hope in Scripture is never built on emotional stability. It is built on orientation. The Bible does not promise that the soul will always feel light, rested, or resolved. It promises something more durable, that the spirit can remain anchored even when the inner world is unsettled. This kind of hope does not deny pain, and it does not rush healing. It allows the process to exist without turning it into a verdict about God or about oneself. That alone removes a great weight from the heart. Many people lose hope not because life is difficult, but because they expect difficulty to disappear once faith is strong enough. When it does not, disappointment quietly replaces trust. Scripture offers a different expectation. Paul speaks of an inner renewal that happens even while the outer experience weakens. This is not contradiction, it is layering. The soul may feel the cost of time, responsibility, and loss. The spirit, however, is being formed in ways the soul cannot always perceive. Hope lives there, not as excitement, but as endurance, with meaning. This hope is realistic. It does not guarantee relief by morning or clarity by next week. It does not promise that emotions will suddenly align with truth. Instead, it offers something steadier, the assurance that feelings are not the final authority over reality. Isaiah writes of those who wait on the Lord renewing their strength, not because circumstances instantly change, but because direction is restored. Waiting, in this sense, is not passivity. It is trust without emotional certainty. Hope without easy promises teaches patience with oneself. It allows bad days without spiritual self-accusation. It permits grief without panic. It gives permission to be human without fearing divine disappointment. This kind of hope does not shout. It stays. It does not depend on motivation. It rests on faithfulness that outlasts feeling. When the soul understands it does not have to produce hope, it relaxes. When the spirit understands it does not have to silence emotion, it strengthens. Between these two, a quieter hope emerges. Not dramatic, not fragile, but reliable. The kind that does not disappear when joy fades. The kind that remains when silence stretches. The Bible calls this hope an anchor, not because it removes the waves, but because it holds through them. As this lesson comes to a close, nothing dramatic needs to happen inside you. No sudden clarity is required. No emotional shift is demanded. What matters is quieter than that. It is the permission to stop confusing what you feel with who you are before God. The soul may still carry weight, the spirit may still be learning how to speak without force. Both are allowed to exist without accusation. Understanding the difference does not remove struggle, but it removes unnecessary shame. It replaces pressure with order. It teaches you how to stand without demanding that everything inside you be calm. Carry this awareness into the coming days. When emotions rise, do not rush to label them spiritually. When silence appears, do not assume something is missing. Let the soul speak honestly, and let the spirit remain steady. Faith does not require emotional perfection. It requires alignment, and alignment often grows slowly, quietly, in ways that do not announce themselves. If this kind of biblical reflection brings clarity rather than noise into your life, remain with this space, not for answers that impress, but for truth that steadies. Subscribe not as a habit, but as a choice to keep learning how Scripture meets real inner life with wisdom and dignity. Let us end with a simple prayer. God of wisdom and patience, you who formed our inner life with intention, teach us to understand ourselves as you do. Help us not to judge our emotions harshly or silence what needs healing. Strengthen our spirit to remain anchored in truth, even when the soul is tired. Grant us discernment instead of fear, peace instead of pressure, and clarity without denial. Teach us to walk faithfully, honestly, and gently before you. Amen.